Good. Then I will start on the insane project of trying to explain Kant's critique of pure reason in 45 minutes. I have taught entire seminars here on Kant's critique of pure reason. It is one of the most difficult works of philosophy ever written. I already mentioned that Richard Rorty said that Immanuel Kant is the person who turned philosophy into a profession, because essentially you have to devote your life to it in order to understand what he's up to. And it's this work that is primarily responsible for that reputation. The critique of pure reason is a very difficult work, and Kant lays out there a view that is often described as transcendental idealism. Now, he himself uses that term, but also feels uncomfortable with the designation idealism. There is a section of the critique of pure reason, in fact, entitled The Refutation of Idealism. And so what we're going to have to figure out today is, what is Kant's view? Is he really an idealist? If so, what kind of idealist? It's an unusual kind. And as we'll see, it turns out that he draws a distinction that few philosophers have made up to this point, but that everyone virtually takes for granted after this. Kant is really the person who started modern philosophy by drawing a set of distinctions and putting forth a position that everyone subsequently has had to respond to, whether or not they're on Kant's side of these issues. So Immanuel Kant, we've met before in the context of his ethical theory. Kant was somebody who was a Prussian philosopher teaching at the University of Königsberg, never traveled more than 10 miles from the place of his birth, nevertheless developed this highly distinctive philosophical view. Well, how did he do it, and what was the core idea? He compares himself to Copernicus. He says what he's doing is bringing about a Copernican revolution in philosophy. Now, who can tell me what Copernicus did in astronomy? What was the core idea of the Copernican revolution? Yeah?
Everything was in circles.
Everything is in circles. Well, that's sort of a vague description of this. Yes?
He had the first widely known heliocentric model of the solar system.
Okay, good. Heliocentric model of the solar system. Now, what does that mean? Up to that point, people thought of the sun and the planets and the stars and so on as revolving around the Earth. We were in the center of the universe, according to those earlier theories. Copernicus said, well, wait a minute, I can do a better job explaining the motions of the stars and planets if I assume not that we're the center and that everything revolves around us, but that actually the sun is the center of the solar system and we are revolving around it. Well, Kant sees himself as implementing a similar kind of revolution, switching the place of subject and object, switching the place of who's the observer, what's doing the revolving around what. Now, as I'll explain in a moment, I think he's giving himself, in a certain sense, too much credit. I think instead of implementing a Copernican revolution in philosophy, he's actually implementing a Ptolemaic revolution in philosophy, because it turns out he's putting himself at the center of things. But let's get to that in time. Here is his general idea. The rationalists up to this point, Descartes, Leibniz, Spinoza, Malebranche, a variety of other thinkers, had been arguing that accounting for the universality and the necessity of some of our knowledge required us to assume that we had knowledge of synthetic and a priori truths. That is to say that since experience is purely particular, there's no way to get to universal truths like scientific laws without the assumption of something that was really a priori, something that could carry us from the particular to the universal. And the same thing, they said, was true of necessity. Laws have this special character. They seem to carry a force of necessity. It's not just an accidental generalization that if I let things go, they fall. No, they must fall. There is a kind of law-like necessity to that. And what's responsible for that? In experience, all we meet with are contingent truths. So, Leibniz and other rationalists argue, there must be something like, a principle, say, every event has a cause, or laws actually govern things through a kind of necessity, and everything is governed by scientific laws. Something, maybe just that the future will resemble the past, whatever the principle is, there must be some synthetic a priori principle that underlies the universality and necessity of our knowledge. And that gives us knowledge of the world independently of experience. But that's a kind of shocking idea. The thought that you could know something about the world without actually experiencing it. The empiricists, of course, challenged that and said, no, no, no. All of our knowledge of the world comes from experience. Everything we know is really based on, yes, particular, and yes, contingent things that we experience. At least everything we know about the world, everything that is a synthetic truth. The rest is all verbal truth. It's analytic. Now, Kant looked at this distinction. He started out as a follower of Leibniz. In fact, his teacher was a student of Leibniz. And so Kant thought of himself very much in that Leibnizian tradition. But then he read David Hume, and he said Hume woke him from his dogmatic slumber. What did he mean by that? Hume suddenly said, well, hold on a second. It looks like all the knowledge I have of the world comes from experience, and you're right that that doesn't justify necessary truths. It doesn't justify universal truth. It doesn't give me anything about the world, as opposed to an analytic truth on the basis of language, that actually displays universality and necessity. So where are those things coming from? Well, Leibniz had said there must be something in reason, something that is a synthetic a priori principle underlying them. Hume said, I think it's just custom. I think it's habit. It's a matter of human nature that we tend to think that the future will resemble the past, that the next time that I drop something, it's actually going to fall. I hold the car keys, I let them go, they fall. And the first time, just stuff happens. But after a while, you get the sense, oh, it's not just that it tends to happen again and again, it has to happen. But where is that coming from? Hume said it's coming from inside me. It is based on my feeling of expectation. It's a result of my own human nature responding to the world. It's not really that I find the necessity in the world itself. Well, Kant said, look, Hume's right about this. I can't really justify the claim that without experience, I can know fundamental truths about the world, like every event has a cause, or the world consists of substances, and they have properties and they stand in relations, or the future will resemble the past. How would I know all of that if it's really about a world that is external to me? Remember the classic rationalist response, as in Philo of Alexandria, who said, here's my solution to the skeptical difficulties I put forward. I assume that God stamps the world and stamps our minds with the same stamp. And so this realm of the forms that Plato described gives us the structure of the world and the structure of the mind. So if I just reflect on the structure of the mind, I know something about the world. But Kant thought Hume was right, that that's a pretty far out there explanation. That won't do it all. How would I know any of that, after all? What would assure me that that had been the case? Now, it's partly, of course, you might think, it rests on a religious assumption. But it isn't just that. How would I know that God had done that, even assuming there is a God? And even assuming that God's ideas do structure the world and do structure my mind, how would I know that God had done it that way? Why couldn't I assume an evil deceiver? In a way, that's the power of Descartes' idea that God could instead be an evil deceiver. What if God stamps our minds with the wrong stamp? It would be like having a stamp of somebody's signature. When I was philosophy chairman, I used to have a, well, I guess I still have it somewhere, I don't know, some stamp that just has my signature on it. So, years before that, a student, because when I first became a professor here, especially on graduate student papers, I frequently would take arguments I didn't think worked, and I would just write bogus on the side with an exclamation point. And so a student actually got me a stamp that said bogus, so I could just stamp papers bogus, bogus, bogus. I know, I was young then, I apologize. But anyway, you might say, what if the stamp is a fake stamp? What if our minds don't have a structure that actually matches the structure of reality? Well, Hume and Kant look at that possibility and say, I don't know how to avoid it. So Kant's idea is this. Hume's right that the source is inside us, of necessity, of universality. But he's wrong that it's just custom, that it's habit, that it's based on feeling. No, Kant says, it really is coming from us, but it is, on the other hand, and this Descartes, Leibniz, and the other rationalists are right about, it really is something that is rational. It is something built into the structure of our minds, not just the structure of the heart, you might say. That feeling of expectation, is it really just an emotional thing? You start seeing this and it's just feeling that makes you think it's going to happen again. It's just like, ooh, I suppose it would, you know, you might have an emotional reaction if I suddenly let it go and just hovered there in the air. That'd be kind of cool, right? And you go, ooh. like the emojis. But, but on the other hand, so there might be an emotional component, but most of the things like this we don't think of as a matter of feeling. Kant says, no, it's a matter of reason. So, here is the core idea of his Copernican Revolution. If I think that my job is to understand a world that is completely independent of me, completely independent of the mind, then Kant says basically, the skeptic wins. I don't see how to justify the claim that I actually have knowledge of that world. Descartes' objection of the evil deceiver, in effect, carries the day. There is no adequate response. We can't talk about clear and distinct ideas or the other things Descartes appealed to. Where are we getting our trust in clear and distinct ideas, after all? And so there's no way to get from inside our heads to the assurance that we're really describing a mind-independent world. So is Kant just a skeptic? No. He says, here's the thing. If we assume that my job is to match a mind-independent world, we can't solve the problem. But if we assume that the world's job is to match my mind, aha, now we can. Now that sounds insane, right? What do you mean the world's job is to match my mind? But here's the idea. My perceptual faculties, vision, smell, touch, taste, and so on, those things actually structure the objects of my experience. They are the things that take this massive experience and organize it into objects. And then my mind, my cognitive faculties are built in such a way as to understand the world in a certain fashion. In other words, my mind structures the world so that I can understand it. Now, what is the world really like, independently of my experience of it? I have no idea. Kant calls that the thing in itself, the noumenon. Okay, the things in themselves, the noumena, plural, who knows what they're like? Maybe, and he thinks there really is, something out there. But we can't say anything about it. The things we organize, that we structure our knowledge around, these objects that we talk about, people, tables, chairs, and so on, even scientific objects, all of those are things that are really products of the mind. So, here's the way he explains the idea. Do our concepts have the job of revolving around the objects of the world, or do the objects of the world revolve around our concepts? Well, that's sort of a shocking idea. Everyone up to this point in Western philosophy had tended to assume, well, up until, at any rate, Berkeley, had tended to assume that the job of the mind is to match the structure of the world. But what if it's the other way around? Kant puts it this way. It has hitherto been assumed that all our knowledge must conform to the objects. But all attempts to ascertain anything about those objects, a priori, independently of experience, by means of concepts, and thus to extend the range of our knowledge, have been rendered abortive by this assumption. So in other words, he's saying, look, the skeptic just wins if my job is to understand a mind-independent world. There is a gap between my mind and this world that is completely independent of it that I can't be sure I'm crossing correctly. In the end, I cannot justify the claim that I have any knowledge at all if that's the job of the intellect. But he says, let's make an experiment. Let's see whether we may not be more successful in metaphysics if we assume that the objects must conform to our knowledge. Now, it isn't the bizarre idea that somehow the world has the job of revolving around me. There is a really narcissistic way of reading Kant. It's like, oh yeah, if my job is to adapt to reality, I'm going to fail. But world, it's your job to match me. Okay? I mean, it's obvious that that doesn't work, right? Suppose I say, you know, I'm tired of this table being up here. I'd much rather have a unicorn up here. Admittedly, a well-behaved unicorn. Okay, I don't want it to be unruly and running around and going to the bathroom all over this stuff. But wouldn't it be cool to have a unicorn instead? So, let it be so. Let this be a unicorn. Didn't happen, stupid world. It's your job to match my concept. Well, no, that doesn't work, right? But the idea is that our minds are structuring experience, shaping it into objects. That what counts as an object is something that is itself the product of my own mental activity. So he says, look, I can make this same experiment with respect to the intuition of objects. And he's using intuition here in the way that Avicenna used it. That is to say, it really means just perception. So we're talking about concepts, but we can also talk about percepts, things that I'm perceiving about the world, He says it's the same thing. I don't see how I can know anything about the world a priori if my perception has to conform to the way objects really are independently of the mind. But if, on the other hand, the object conforms to the nature of our faculty of intuition, that is to say perception, I can then easily conceive of the possibility of such a priori knowledge. Now, what does he mean? The objects have to conform to my faculty of intuition, to my perceptual faculties. Well, have you ever noticed how the world goes by in time? It's one thing, then another thing. Oh, I should have set this up to play you something from, well, no, our sax player yesterday was absolutely on fire doing all this Ornette Coleman stuff. It's awesome. And it happens in time, right? Music happens in time. It's something that goes on the basis of boom, boom, boom. It takes place in time. And in fact, all of our experiences like that. It's not just music, it's not just finger clicks. Everything takes place in time. So you might think, well, yes, the world is somehow structured temporally. Or you could say, I perceive things in time, and I perceive them in space. But actually, is the world really structured in a spatial and temporal fashion? Or is it that my perceptual faculties are organizing things for me and arranging them in space, arranging them in time? I don't know whether the world as it exists in itself is really in space and time or not, Kant is saying, but I know that I perceive it that way. And so what if that spatio-temporal factor of the world, that feature of the world, is coming from within my mind, not from the actual nature of the objects themselves? So he says, we here propose to do just what Copernicus did in attempting to explain the celestial movements. When he found that he could make no progress by assuming that all the heavenly bodies revolved around the spectator, he reversed the process and tried the experiment of assuming that the spectator revolved while the stars remained at rest. Now maybe you can see why I said it's actually kind of the opposite of this. It's more like a Ptolemaic revolution, because this is, I mean, Copernicus was saying, hey, it doesn't all revolve around us, we revolve around it. Kant is saying, what if our concepts don't revolve around the world? What if the world revolves around our concepts? So it's almost just the reverse of what Copernicus did, but it's a similar shift in perspective. Now, this has big implications. If we assume that things go in the other direction, that objects have to conform to my perceptual faculties and to my concepts instead of the other way around, it turns out we can know something about the world a priori. But of course, about the world, quote-unquote, a priori, the world as we perceive it. I don't know whether the things in themselves, for example, are spatial or temporal in their organization, but I know I perceive it that way. I know the objects of my experience are so structured, and I can know that a priori. So he says, before objects are given to me a priori, I must presuppose in myself laws of the understanding, which are expressed in concepts a priori. To these concepts, then, all objects of experience must necessarily conform. Not only do they have to be structured in space and time, but they have to actually fit the concepts that are the concepts my mind is built with, basically. The thought is this: my mind comes already pre-equipped with certain concepts. And I organize the world into objects and then understand those objects in terms of the equipment I'm given. And so I have to actually structure it in a way that those concepts apply. Well, Kant is giving us here maybe the most famous transcendental argument in Western philosophy. Here's the general form of transcendental argument. The idea is something is a necessary condition of the possibility of something else. So if that thing is actually possible, then this thing must necessarily be true. So in general, Q is a necessary condition for the possibility of P. P wouldn't even be possible if it weren't true to Q. But wait a minute, P is true, P is possible. In fact, usually the argument for that is just, well, P is the case. That's why it's possible, we know it's actual. Therefore, Q must be the case. So, here's how it goes. We could not understand the world. We could not have experience. We could not, certainly, have a priori knowledge of the world unless we had a priori concepts and laws of the understanding. Okay, those are necessary conditions of the possibility of experience. But experience is obviously possible. I'm having an experience right now, right? So it's possible, I'm having an experience, it's actual, so yay, it's possible for me to have experience, but that would be the case only if my mind were actually organizing the various phenomena the world presents to me and structures them in a certain kind of way using these a priori concepts of laws. So there are a priori concepts and there are laws of the understanding. Now, if you don't find that very convincing, because so far we really haven't talked a lot about the possibility of experience, just think about the possibility of universal and necessary knowledge. That is something that would be impossible unless the mind were supplying something. Here Kant thinks that Leibniz has given us crucial arguments. We could not get universality and necessity out of experience. They're coming from something else. And so, universal knowledge, necessary knowledge, any knowledge of laws, those would be impossible unless we had a priori concepts and laws of the understanding that were structuring in the world in such a way that those things actually hold universally and necessarily. Now, this, he thinks, does have a sweeping conclusion, which is partly a skeptical conclusion. This places limits on my knowledge. I can know a priori only what my mind places in things. So in other words, do I know things in themselves? Do I know what the world is really like? Is the world really structured spatially, temporally, causally? Causally, I don't know. I have no idea. I know that the objects of my experience are structured causally. I know that they come to me in space and time. But as for the things in themselves, are they really like that? Or are these things that are only being supplied by my mind to a reality that's not like that at all? He says, I have no idea. I have no way of knowing it. So I can only know a priori the things that my mind is placing in things. That means that the laws that govern the realm of experience, things like every event has a cause, those are things that apply to the objects of experience. But do they apply to the world in itself? Do they apply to a thing in itself, something that would really be independent of the mind? Kant says, I don't know. So, we can know things a priori, but only as our mind structures them, only as they're experienced by us. We cannot know the thing in itself. So, somebody says, hey look, I'm sorry, Kant, I think there really is a world out there. I think it is really external to us. It's really independent of the mind. And it's our job to match it. And Kant says, look, you may be right. In fact, I have reasons for thinking you are right, that we need to talk about a world out there, a thing in itself. But he says, I have no way of knowing anything about it. I know how it presents itself to my cognitive faculties. I know how I perceive it. That's all I can know. What is it really like independently of my perception of it, independently of my thinking of it? I don't know. Yeah.
So why doesn't Kant say that this world independent necessarily exists based on the transcendental argument? Because if we can,
yes,
if those things, this is confusing.
No, good.
Yeah.
Good. Let's go back to the structure of the transcendental argument. Okay, it has to do with what is a necessary condition of something. Now, we're going to see next time, actually, Hegel, another German philosopher who followed not too long after Kant, say, wait a minute. This world out there, a thing in itself, I mean, what good is it? Actually, you're admitting you don't know anything about it. So he has this idea. If your philosophy contains something you can't know anything about, not only that you don't know anything about, but you really cannot know anything about, then it can't play any role in your theory, can it? And so Hegel says, just get rid of it. It's not doing any work for you. Eliminate it. Now Kant thinks you can't do that. That actually, it's important that he talk about the thing in itself. Why? Well, he does have this section of the critique that he calls the refutation of idealism. And the argument he gives is one we're going to look at in more detail next week. But I think of it as the missing explanation argument. It basically goes like this. My mind is presented with all sorts of stuff, and it is not under my control. I can say, let the table become a unicorn. And it doesn't happen. I can say, I am tired of this chair being rust-colored. I want it to be lime green. Doesn't happen. I can think, wow, I would like to be rich and famous. nothing happened, right? No zeros were added to my bank account as a result of that wish. So reality seems beyond my control. And in fact, it also seems to display a lot of regularities. I mean, look at this. You're all here, and you're sitting in these chairs, and I turn around. You're still here. Wow. Okay, that's amazing. Now, you would think, wait a minute, if my mind is making all this up, and indeed, the way that Kant's thinking of this, you might almost think of it this way. My mind is just like a projector, and it's projecting the world around me. Well, if that's what it's doing it in an awfully predictable way. It's doing something in a way that actually, has a kind of coherence to it. I can't make it project something different. I also can't just suddenly change it. I can't think, I wish we were conducting class, by the banks of the Seine in Paris. We're still in Austin, right? We're not suddenly transported. I can't control those things. And Kant says, well, why can't I? Why are there these regularities? Why are there these features of experience that seem resistant to my will? And not only to my will, really to, you might say, the thought that there must be something. There must be something that is actually affecting my sense organs in such a way as to give me this experience of the world. The problem is I can't say anything about it. And in fact, as we'll see, Hegel's argument is in part, look, the way you set up your categories, you can't even officially say there must be something. You can't say it exists. You can't say anything about it. And so you're in this odd position of saying, I think we can't do without reference to a world that is really independent of mine, the thing in itself. But I also don't see how I can say anything at all about it. And that's a weird combination. Yeah? Yes, good. There are two arguments that we've encountered in discussing skepticism that are really close to this position. And one is Augustine's idea, that I may not know whether that's really sweet, but I know it tastes sweet to me. And so Augustine, you could say, looking back on it, is really drawing a distinction like this. Kant is saying, yeah, I don't know what the world is really like out there, but I know how it appears to me. And not just at this moment. It appears in an awfully regular way, and not just to me, but to all of us. So he's basically saying, I not only know how it appears to me right now, I know in general how it appears to us. And guess what? It appears to us in similar ways because we have similar faculties of perception, and we have similar minds that are structured conceptually in similar ways. And so, exactly, it's taking that idea of Augustine's and really running with it and forming a big picture of the universe out of it. The other idea from the history of skepticism, this is really close to, is Philo's argument from comparison. Remember, Philo had said, I don't know how things are in themselves, I just know how they relate to other things. And in particular, how they relate to me. So I know something about the relations among things, but I don't know what the things in themselves are. I know something about how I perceive them. I don't know what they're really like in themselves. And that, too, is really similar to the distinction Kant is drawing. So yes, I think if you look back at the history of skepticism, you can see where Kant is getting the idea. Already, Philo and Augustine had made moves something like this, but they were talking about particular cases. Kant says, well, that's true of the whole world, all the time for all of us. And we have enough in common that it isn't just this quirk of mind that tastes sweet, or that I see things in space and time. It's our quirk. Human nature is something that does this because of the structure of the mind. So yeah, excellent observation. You had a question.
Oh, I was just wondering, is the reason why we can't affect this because it's kind of like similar to the solar system, how regardless of what's in the center or what's not, it can't be controlled either way?
Oh, well, that's a good point. If you think about the Copernican idea, it doesn't really matter in a sense whether you're at the center of the solar system or not. You still have observations and things are still moving around in a way that's independent of you. And so similarly here, you might think, yeah, no matter what's going on with these objects of experience, they are moving in a way that's independent of my will for the most part. Not entirely. I can think, iPad rise. Huh. And it does when I actually move it. So some things I can affect. But you're right, it's in a way not surprising given the astronomical example that it's not controlled by me. Even, I mean, it would be a silly objection to the Ptolemaic theory to say, of course the universe doesn't revolve around you. If it does, make the sun stop. I can't do that. Now here, it's a little bit more subtle, because the idea behind needing the thing in itself is really to try to explain something about how experience, not only how our minds are set up to expect regularities in experiments, but why it actually gets them. Imagine being in a world which really just was randomly generated. The world doesn't appear that way to us, but you might think, I can imagine a situation where it does, and I'm going to have a hard time actually perceiving it as a bunch of objects standing in relations. It's going to be just this weird swirl of random stuff. And in that case, you could say, yeah, the world has to have some contribution to explaining why it seems regular to us. Well, let's take a look at the larger picture. I've already mentioned this. In fact, I should have moved this up earlier. Space and time are things that structure the world for us, but they are a matter of perception. Kant draws a distinction between sensibility and understanding, basically between perception and concepts. And space and time he sees as the forms of sensibility. They are a priori forms. I know that an object is going to be given to me in space and time. And to see that that really does have a kind of universality and necessity. Suppose I were to write a short story, and I were to say, John, well, gosh, it's hard to write such a short story because I can't really put it there. But I'll try. John walked into the classroom. He looked around and he saw something. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before. It wasn't in the room. It wasn't outside the room. It wasn't above the room. It wasn't below the room. In fact, it wasn't in space and time at all. Did he see it after he walked into the room? Well, no. Did he see it before he walked into the room? As he walked into the room? No, it wasn't in time. And now I'm thinking, what? I don't understand the story. Okay. Now, if he imagined something, if you thought, oh, he was thinking about the number 3, but he perceived it, but it wasn't above or below or outside or inside, and it wasn't before or after or during, I don't know what you're talking about. And Kant would say, look, that shows us that space and time are a priori forms of sensibility. It's not just that objects happen most of the time to be in space and time. No, they have to be in space and time to be perceived by us. We can't even imagine what it would be like to perceive something outside of space and time. And that tells us this really does carry a kind of necessity to it. So it really is something that is a form of sensibility. The idea that perceptible objects exist in space and time, that everything we experience in space and time. Those are things that are a priori truths. But they're synthetic. They are not things that are true just by definition. They are real claims about the world. Anything you perceive in space. Anything you perceive in time. Those are things that he says are universal, they're necessary, they're not something we derive from experience, they are something that underlies our experience. They're something that actually tells us what objects of experience have to be like. Yeah?
So if there were to be some kind of thing that exists outside of space and time, would Kant say that that's supporting evidence for the mind-independent world? Or
Okay, well, if we postulated something that exists outside of space and time, then you might say, yes, that would be evidence for its being really mind-independent. It would not be just an object of experience. We can't imagine what it would be like to experience such a thing. But on the other hand, there could be such a thing. I mean, it could be that the entire world is outside of space and time. Actually, many people, not everyone who adheres to the classical conception of God, but many people think of God as existing outside of space and time. So the idea of something existing outside space and time is not absurd, Kant would say. What's absurd is the idea of experiencing something, perceiving something outside space and time. And indeed, even if you think of a traditional religious picture where you, let's say, die and go to heaven and come face to face with God, you have to think of it as happening in time, right? You think of, I can't sort of think, oh yeah, and then I saw the face of God. But that didn't happen after I died or before I died. It was just like, all of a sudden my brain goes like, I don't know, I can't imagine that anymore, right? And according to that religious conception, well, yeah, you can't really imagine heaven. So, or maybe what we, it's you're perceiving. It's not exactly like perceiving in the way we do now. Many things you can say. There's no absurdity in the idea. But as soon as I try to combine my perception, my concept of perception that I have from this world, with the encounter with something totally outside of space and time, it doesn't work. Suddenly I can't do it. Yeah?
How can there be synthetic truths if the world is, the concepts of the world are adjusting according to me?
Yeah. Okay, how can there be synthetic knowledge of the world if the objects are adjusting to me?
How can we have universal laws if everything adjusting itself according to me?
Ah, okay, good. Right. How is it possible to really have universality and necessity? If the world's adjusting itself to me, then isn't the way in which it adjusts going to change? Might it be different for me and for you and so on? These are all points that Hegel will make next time. Kant thinks, no, the way all this happens is universal. That is to say, our perceptual faculties vary. Some of us have better eyesight than others, better hearing than others, and so on and so forth. However, we all perceive things in space and time. They all structure things in terms of space and time. We all agree in that. Similarly, different cultures might have different concepts they use to understand the world, but in the end, every culture thinks of things existing in some sort of temporal order, thinks of things existing in space, thinks of things as structured causally, so some things cause other things. And Kant would say those are just universal features of the human mind. Those are not things that vary, so we don't have to worry that they'll stop being true. As long as we're human beings, we're going to be doing that. Those are absolutely universal. Hegel will come along and say, I don't see why I assume anything in the structure of the human mind is universal and necessary and can't change. But Kant thinks it is unchanging. And I think his response to Hegel would be something like, then fine, point to history and show me a culture where nobody believed in causation, where people didn't think of things as existing in space and time, where they didn't know how to translate a term like on or between or inside. Come on, there's no such culture. And so Kant would say those things really are universal beyond any specific set of concepts or any specific way in which people perceive things. Everybody has those features in common. So in that way, he'd say, look, our experiences and our ways of thinking about things can vary somewhat, but they can't vary that much. Yeah?
So there's an argument to be made, I guess, time is man-made, that it's kind of like that's how I don't know how to explain it. So how would you use it, define that a priori concept, I guess, if it's a man-made concept?
Oh, well, in a way, Kant's saying yes. Time is something that, as far as we know anyway, is man-made. It's something that our perceptual faculties are inducing, whatever the shape. Talking about things existing in space. Yeah, see, I run into this. I can't just walk through. But things happen in time, and that's something that our faculties of perception are really supplying. They're forcing things to be presented to us in time. Are they really temporal? Kant says, I don't know. Now, further, I then not only am responsible, you might say, for things being in time, but now I have this task of measuring time. And so how do I do that? And here's a place, often when people say the kind of thing you just said, what they really mean is not to refer to Kant's point, but to the point that, in a way, it's a real puzzle. How do you actually structure time? And if you stop and think about it for a moment, the way in which we do it is a little bit bizarre. I mean, notice other things have a kind of decimal character to them, but time, how many seconds are in a minute? 60. How many minutes in an hour? 60. How many hours in a day? 24, right? How many days in a year? 365. You might say, oh, you know, about what, 40 years ago there was this attempt to get the United States on the metric system, totally failed. But what if somebody said, hey, what if we do a metric system for time? And, I mean, come on, there should be 10 seconds in a minute, and 10 minutes in an hour, and 10 hours in a day, and 10 days in a month, and 10 months in a year. And then we'll just adjust all the, you know, we'll translate that back to what it is now. Why don't we do that? I don't know, but that's one indication that things are really man-made. We are structuring all of this. And in fact, there's a fascinating history to clocks, to the ways in which people have tried to subdivide time. Calendars keep changing over the centuries because people set up a calendar system and it works pretty well, and then suddenly you find that winter's arriving in the middle of March and you say, yeah, something's gone wrong, we need a new calendar. So, in short, well, I'm speaking here from the perspective of someone in the Northern Hemisphere. But anyway, that's the sort of thing that makes you suddenly think, yeah, the way in which we do all this is something we certainly devised. Now, is time itself something that's a human construction? Compensable as far as we know, yeah. So it's not just those concepts of time, those particular ways of measuring time, etc. It's really just time itself that is also a human construction. Okay, now, there are, Kant says, certain basic categories in the mind. How do we find out what these basic concepts, these a priori concepts that the mind is built with and doesn't get from experience? What are those concepts? He says, well, if you want to know what they are, look at logic. Look at the logical structure of our experience. So, for example, we categorize things in terms of quantity. Sometimes we refer to one thing. So the idea of unity and the concepts of an object, a thing, of one, of something unified, of this, that, the, those are things that are really built into the structure of the mind. We divide singular from plural, one from many. And so plurality is also one of the basic concepts in the mind. Some, several, totality, all, every, each, all of these things, which are basic concepts of logic, he says are really basic categories of the mind. Those are things we're not getting from experience. Those are things we're bringing to experience. We use them to organize our experience. There are also things involving quality. So what he means by that is, well, roughly the difference between yes and no, between something being true and false. There are things that we think are the case. So is, yes, true. Those are things that we bring to experience. The same thing as negation. Not, un, okay, in, false, no. All of those things are things that we bring to experience. We are the ones who say, yes, that's the way it is. No, it's not. Well, you know, to some extent, etc., etc. All of those are categories we supply. Then there are categories of relation. So these are things like, well, not only is, in a different sense now, is something, is, let's say, I am wearing a blue shirt. I'm talking about quality. There is a quality that inheres in me. The distinction between a substance, a quality or a property, a relation, the idea of something exhibiting something else, exemplifying something else, all of these, the idea of an example, an instance, all of those are things that are built into the structure of the mind. The same thing with causation. If then, this because that, this causes that, this is an effect of or a result of that. All of those are things that are really built into the structure of the mind. And then finally, the idea of community, of if and only if, of things going together. Not this thing causing that thing, or that thing causing this thing, but the two moving in tandem. So things like part and whole, and or, unless, the idea of reciprocity, all of those are things that are coming, you might say, from the structure of the mind itself. Well, then there are modal categories. Things like possibility and impossibility, actuality and non-actuality, non-existence, necessity, contingency. Those are things, again, that we don't find in experience. We bring them to experience. The mind organizes things as possible or impossible, necessary or contingent. We don't find those things in the world. Well, now, are there other categories? Those were the basic categories of logic in Kant's time, and in fact, Kant in his lectures on logic said, logic is one of those beautiful disciplines that, you know, everything we'll ever know about it has been known and has been more or less stable ever since Aristotle. And then within 50 years, George Boole totally transformed logic and created modern logic in a mathematical form. But there are lots of things that now logicians might want to add to this list. Things like many and few, or infinitely many, countably many. Things like tenses of verbs. Things like other sorts of relations. Something being near or far, being closer than, being greater than, being equal to. Maybe other kinds of modalities, like should, or ought, or typically, or normally, etc. Anyway, I don't want to go into a lot of that. But here's the idea. Kant says we put these a priori concepts together in ways that actually structure our experience of the world. So, what are some of these synthetic a priori judgments we get out of this? All of mathematics, first of all. 7 plus 5 is 12 is his example. But really all of math is synthetic and a priori. He says, how about things like this? The world consists of objects. They stand in relations to one another. Every event has a cause. Everything relates to everything else. These are things, he says, that we aren't getting from experience. They are things that are built into the very structure of the mind itself. So, there is a basic distinction here between phenomena, the objects of our experience. Our a priori knowledge does apply to those, but then noumena, the things in themselves that are independent of the mind, those are things we cannot know anything about at all. The categories do not even apply to us.